Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center, and Professor of Law here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And we're very pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. Each of these talks in the summer is worth one Vermont CLE credit. So if you're hoping to claim those credits, all you need to do is keep track of which talks you attend for your own records. And we will have time for Q&A after the presentation today. So if you are watching on the VLGS YouTube site, you can enter your questions in the chat space at any point during the talk, and we'll collect them all and get through as many as we can at the end. Our speaker today is Alex Barron. Professor Barron is an associate professor of environmental science and policy at Smith College. He has applied his training as a scientist to policy design in Congress, at the Environmental Protection Agency, and in the White House. In Congress, he worked in both the Senate and House of Representatives to design comprehensive climate legislation, including the American Clean Energy and Security Act, and covered international climate negotiations. And at EPA, Professor Barron worked in the Office of Policy, where he advised senior EPA leadership and worked on a wide range of environmental regulations, including standards to reduce carbon pollution, like the Clean Power Plan, cross-state air pollution, and mercury and other toxics. He also helped guide EPA's work on environmental economics and climate adaptation. He most recently served in the Biden administration's Office of Management and Budget, helping to restore strong and sensible climate and environmental regulations. And Professor Barron's current research focuses on the design of climate policies to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and avoid catastrophic climate change. This includes evaluating how policies have worked in the past, designing specific policy incentives to reduce emissions, and work to improve the tools that policymakers use when designing these policies. The courses he teaches include researching environmental problems, sustainable solutions, sustainability and social ecological systems, and energy and climate policy. And Professor Barron graduated from Carleton College with a BA in chemistry and obtained a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton. Today, he will deliver a talk titled Transforming College Operations for Climate Justice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alex Barron.
All right. Well, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today on what has become a sort of little side quest in my research. As you heard, the bulk of my research focus is on national scale climate policy, but I've also gotten very interested in institutional climate policy, which is what I'll talk about today. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Aaron Strong at Hamilton College, Laura Drauker, who's now at Ceres, and then Smith undergraduates at the time, Lucy Metz and Maya Domashek. And then we're in the process of updating some of this work. And so I want to acknowledge that Jenny Ding and Cheravi Chetri have been helping to move this forward. So the plan for today is to just really briefly put net zero and carbon neutrality in some context, and then talk about why we chose to look at higher education for this work. And then we'll dig into the data about how colleges are actually getting to carbon neutral with a focus on accounting-based strategies and comparing things with the system scale. And then we'll wrap up with a little sort of bit of our policy thinking about what a revised and more ambitious leadership framework might look like. So I don't think for this audience, I have to go into a bunch of detail to say that climate change is really bad for a huge host of reasons. We need to be much more aggressive than we are about acting on climate change. Here's an IPCC figure that just shows the gap between implemented policies and what we need to be doing. And you can see that the sort of goal here to limit warming to 1.5C or as close to that as possible is to get global emissions to net zero. And we see that that net zero framework has mapped down into country level commitments. And so here's just a map showing different countries that have adopted net zero targets, either in law or in a policy document or pledge. And so it's good to see that countries are adopting these net zero frameworks, but they could be much more ambitious, many of them, in terms of timing. And even countries that do often have these targets are not often on track to achieve them. And we can take as our example here the United States. So in 2021, the Biden-Harris administration committed to greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, as an interim target on the way to net zero emissions by no later than 2050. And this modeling analysis by the Rhodium Group, if you look at the blue area, shows a sort of good news, bad news story. So the good news is that the landmark Inflation Reduction Act has put us on track to significantly reduce our emissions over the next 5+ years, and reduce emissions to something like 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. The bad news is that's obviously still a ways from the Biden-Harris administration's target and what we would want to be doing if we want to have a serious chance of hitting our long-term target in 2050. The good news is that you can see that the Rhodium Group also modeled a joint action scenario. And in this scenario, not only do the Inflation Reduction Act policies remain in place, but the US government continues to use executive branch authority to regulate pollution and drive emissions reductions. States are active in pursuing climate policy, and many non-state actors like businesses and other institutions are taking aggressive steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if there is this sort of collective effort at multiple scales to increase our ambition, modeling analysis at least suggests that the 2030 target is still within reach, right? So this is a thing we could do if we chose to get serious about it. And as we've lagged behind on our climate goals and the need to get more ambitious has become more clear, what we've seen is that a lot of non-state actors have adopted their own climate commitments. And so this is a now somewhat dated slide, but it shows just a sort of subsample of the many companies that have adopted some kind of net zero target. And so to the extent that these companies are making aggressive steps towards meeting their targets, this can be a really helpful assist in our collective action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it's a little challenging because we're not really sure what the end state is going to look like for a lot of these companies, in part because so many of the companies' commitments are out in 2050, which is still a little bit of a ways off. And also there's varying degrees of transparency about how much progress these companies are making towards their net zero commitments, which can make it a little bit harder to figure out what's going on and how we can drive this sort of voluntary action to be more aggressive and more impactful. So for this research, we were basically asking, if climate justice requires rapid emissions reductions, what can we learn about early movers that have already achieved carbon neutrality, and what these carbon neutrality net zero actions can actually accomplish? And how can we focus that institutional action so that we're getting rapid systems leverage and really driving these larger system scale changes? And so for this work, we chose to focus on higher education. And it's not just because I'm at an institution of higher education. There's really sort of three large categories of reasons why you might want to take a look at higher education. And the first is that there's a host of structural factors that make higher education kind of an interesting object for study. The first is that these are long-lived institutions, right? Many higher education institutions in the US are hundreds of years old. And so there's a potential, at least for these institutions to be thinking on these longer timescales rather than just shooting for the next quarterly earnings report. And so that can, at least in theory, lead them to be more aligned with the long-term thinking required to reach climate solutions. The second is that although climate is not often a core component of, say, an institution's mission statement, these are institutions that have some social mission, that often have some commitment to community and society. And again, that can link naturally with climate action. Third, obviously, higher education, these are centers of the research and innovation. that we're going to need during the climate transition. And so they're interesting and can play a role in leveraging that expertise. And finally, most higher education institutions are going to be a lot more transparent about what they're doing on the climate front. And we'll see more about that in a bit, which is going to allow us to sort of really understand what's happening as these schools are taking action. So those are some structural factors. There's also, if we just take a strict mitigation lens where we just care about tons, higher education is actually an important sector. So there's about 29 million people, faculty, students, and staff at US HEIs. And if you add all that up, you'd be maybe about the third largest state in the US. And so that's a lot of people and a lot of associated emissions. You know, these campuses can often operate like small cities. The larger ones will have their own small transportation networks. They have their own power plants, their own heating networks, and lots of buildings. And so to that degree are sort of good analogs for major chunks of society that we need to decarbonize. And they're also just significant on an emissions basis. We do not have a great estimate of the emissions from US higher education because there's no framework that requires all schools to report their emissions, but at least one study in the literature estimates 120 million metric tons of emissions, and that's actually probably a significant undercount when you start to expand what you're thinking about. So that would be, you know, a notable industrial sector for context. So we should care about these, care about higher education as a sector that we need to decarbonize. And then the third reason is that higher education in the US is actually relatively unique as one of the first sectors that I'm aware of globally where a large number of the players came together and committed to carbon neutrality. So way back in 2006 and 2007, they launched the American College and University President's Climate Commitment with over 800 colleges and universities. And these schools committed to conduct an emissions inventory to know where their climate pollution was coming from, to develop a plan for carbon neutrality, and to set a target date for emissions neutrality, quote, as soon as possible. And over time, this commitment was taken over by Second Nature, a nonprofit. And so from here on out, I'll just be referring to it as the Second Nature climate commitment, which is a bit less of a mouthful. And I do want to acknowledge at this stage that Second Nature has been really great at sort of helping us to understand the data and reporting under the commitment and answering our questions and working with us here. And so we can sort of follow the trajectory of the climate commitment in higher ed over time. So I mentioned that it kicked off in 2006 and 2007. There were 12 founding signatories, and at its peak, reporting varies, but generally between 700 and 800 schools are reported as having signed on to the commitment. By the time we came around and were publishing our research in 2021, there were 426 institutions active with the commitment, 362 of which had gotten around to setting carbon neutrality dates. And at that time, there were 11 carbon neutral schools. So this is great because it gives us a small population of institutions that have actually met the goals of the commitment so we can understand how they did so. And since I'm doing this talk not in 2021, but in 2024, we've continued to track effort in the space. There's about 378 institutions reporting on the new platform where their Second Nature is asking schools to report, which is about 10% of public and nonprofit HEIs. So it's a significant portion of the sector, but there's obviously a lot of room to get more schools serious about adopting some kind of climate commitment. And we see about 14 carbon neutral schools, depending on how you count. And the second thing I want to flag just in the sort of broader structure is that when we looked in the paper at the years by which schools had announced that they would achieve neutrality, this is what we found. And so you can see that there's a lot of schools that had announced neutrality right in this sort of 2050 timeframe, and then a significant number of schools that actually had commitments after 2050. So this is an area that needs a little bit of updating, given that the US as a whole is now committed to achieve carbon neutrality by before 2050, if possible. So there's room for increased ambition here as well. So before I get into the details of what schools have done, we need to talk a little bit about what carbon neutrality means within the context of the second nature climate commitment for higher education. And in corporate and higher ed greenhouse gas emissions accounting, there's basically three categories of emissions that people talk about. So the first category is scope 1 emissions. These are, you can think of as direct fossil fuel use. So this is burning fossil fuels in equipment that's owned and on the campus. So primarily this is burning fossil fuels for heat, especially in a place like Vermont, but also things like the campus vehicle fleet or any other greenhouse gases directly released by the campus. But there was a recognition that that's not the only greenhouse gas emissions that we should care about. And so the next category is scope 2. This is purchased energy. So you can think of this as electricity purchases, although there are some schools that purchase steam or chilled water, which would also go in this category. And then scope 3 emissions, you can think of as everything else that's not in scope 1 and scope 2. In the corporate accounting world, this is both upstream and downstream greenhouse gas emissions. So everything in your supply chain, steel or rubber or aluminum that you're buying to build cars, but also emissions associated with the use and disposal of products. For higher education, greenhouse gas accounting in the context of this commitment, scope 3 is much narrower. It really only includes employee travel and employee commuting, although some schools include a little bit of waste in this category. And that came from a recognition that back in 2006, 2007, when they were designing the commitment, there were not great tools out there to understand scope 3 emissions, and in many cases, not great options for reducing them. So I want to just acknowledge that things like food purchases and building materials for new construction are not included in the totals that you're going to see when we walk through the data. All right, so with that in mind, here's just a quick illustration of what that looks like for an individual institution. So I pulled Vermont Law's greenhouse gas reporting here, and you can see the scope 1 emissions in dark blue, the scope 2 emissions in green, and then scope 3, which is again commuting and air travel, in the gray. And you can see that the scope 3 is actually much smaller in the most recent reporting year, which I'm going to maybe attribute to a few knock-on effects from the pandemic. And the relative mix of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 is really going to vary from institution to institution, depending on whether they burn fuels on campus to heat or purchase the energy, whether they have a lot of people commuting to campus or whether it's a mostly residential campus, whether there's a lot of flying with university funds, those kinds of things. So we wanted to look at these greenhouse gas emissions for the schools that had announced that they had achieved carbon neutrality. Basically, what does the mix of strategies look like for schools that have succeeded in meeting the goals of the commitment? And when we started this work, 2007, College of the Atlantic in Maine achieved carbon neutrality. We not included them in our sample here because by the time we were getting around to this work, they were no longer claiming neutrality. And so we really started with schools that announced in 2011. And so we published a paper, you can see it here in the journal One Earth, that covered the 11 schools that had announced carbon neutrality at the time that we published the paper. So that's the first 11 schools in bold here, but I'm also going to show you some analysis today that includes all 14 schools that are in bold. We haven't yet brought Catawba College, which announced in 2023, into the data, but I've looked at their reports and I can tell you that it's not going to change the overall story that we're telling today very much. So what we did was we weren't, I want to acknowledge actually before we go further that, it's hard to go first. It's hard to be the first one to raise your hand in class. And these schools deserve a lot of credit for moving quickly to try and address their greenhouse gas emissions reductions, for setting ambitious targets under the commitment, and also for being really great about sort of answering the 10,000 questions we had about details in their data. And what we were able to do is aggregate all that data together because we didn't want this study to be about individual schools so much, although we do discuss each school's strategy in some detail in an appendix. what we wanted to do is look at the aggregate impact of this commitment and what kinds of behaviors it was driving schools towards. And so this somewhat complex figure really summarizes all of that. So what you can see on the left in purple is the sum total across all, in this case, 11 schools of their greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1, that's the direct fossil fuels. Scope 2, purchased energy. And Scope 3, everything else. And then this waterfall chart steps through the different strategies that schools used to reduce emissions and how much it accounted for the overall neutrality of this group. And we divided into two categories, what we call direct reductions, which are those that are sort of really occurring most directly associated with the source. And then this larger category of accounting-based reductions, where really what's going on is that emissions are being reduced somewhere else, and the college is taking credit for that. And you can see that the largest source of emissions reductions is actually offsets. That is, colleges paying for projects somewhere else that reduce emissions and using that to claim neutrality instead of reducing on-site. And they were responsible for just over 50% in aggregate of the emissions reductions that we saw. That was followed closely by the use of renewable energy certificates. I'm not going to go into that in really great detail today. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A if people have questions. And then the third largest category here was bioenergy. And you can see actually relatively small reductions directly in any of the categories of emissions reductions. So really the story of where the emissions reductions are coming from is in these accounting-based measures. And there's a lot to unpack in this chart and talk through, but for the purposes of today's talk, I really want us to talk specifically about these Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because these are the schools usually directly buying and combusting fossil fuels, and they're doing so in infrastructure that they control and own themselves. And so you can imagine pathways where a state might pass a policy that could clean up the electricity supply, which would reduce Scope 2 emissions, or that things could happen in a supply chain to reduce Scope 3 emissions. But the Scope 1 emissions are those that are really under the direct control of the institution, and the one where really there isn't anyone else that is going to reduce those emissions. Schools are going to have to take the steps to reduce emissions there. And so if we just simplify this chart and zoom in to look at Scope 1 emissions, and here we're looking at all the 14 schools that we had documented by 2021, here's where the reductions in Scope 1 emissions came from. And again, you can see this large role of offsets. For Scope 1, it was actually 66% of the aggregate reductions came from offsets. And then 25% came from reductions attributed to bioenergy. And only 8% of the reductions came from what we would consider a direct reduction in on-site fossil fuel use, either through energy efficiency or adopting some kind of zero carbon technology. And the picture gets even more nuanced if we look actually at the individual schools. And so you can see in this figure the percentage reduction relative to their baseline year for a bunch of different institutions. And so you can see that there's a cluster here. The only schools that had greater than 50% reductions that they claimed in Scope 1 emissions adopted a bioenergy strategy where they're assuming that the bioenergy is carbon neutral, and we'll come back around to that. And then there were a handful of schools that made what I would call notable reductions in their Scope 1 emissions, on the order of 20 to 30%. Which is the kind of thing you could expect from an aggressive energy efficiency initiative. So that's good to see, but obviously not all the way to decarbonization. And then you can see that there is actually a number of schools in the study that we looked at that had very little change in their Scope 1 emissions, and a few that actually increased their Scope 1 emissions relative to their baseline year, while reporting that they had achieved carbon neutrality. And so we really need to understand better sort of what's going on here and how these measures worked out. Obviously, for those schools, it was an offset-based strategy that got them to zero for Scope 1. And so I want to take a little bit of time and talk about these two big strategies that were used for achieving neutrality for Scope 1 emissions. purchasing offsets, and this was largely from the voluntary offset market, and then bioenergy accounting. A lot of these schools that use this strategy were in New England, and they were either directly burning wood or purchasing some kind of biofuel made from wood. So I'll start with bioenergy. Schools were able to use this strategy because the second nature guidelines, along with many other sort of climate guidelines around the world, often assume that, allow you to assume that bioenergy is carbon neutral. That is, any emissions from burning the biomass are compensated for by the uptake of carbon by plants growing somewhere else. And the core of the challenge here is that if there's two things that the scientific community is clear about. One is that accounting for bioenergy is really complicated. You could have an entire semester-long seminar series about it. And two, that you actually can't assume that all biomass is carbon neutrality sort of out of the gate, that it really depends on the nuances of the situation. And just to give you an idea of the possible risks involved here, there's a study by Rolls and Forster that I believe was actually funded by the biomass industry that found that the payback on carbon emissions from biomass burned in New England could be as large as 50 to 100 years. That is, the carbon that's emitted when the biomass is burned isn't fully compensated for at least 50 or 100 years. So well beyond when we're trying to meet our goals of net zero emissions for a country or as a planet. Is that the right number? I'm not going to say that. There's a lot of people who are bigger experts in bioenergy accounting than I am, but I think it's, as we consider these strategies, the risk here of actually making things worse in the short run is notable. I want to acknowledge that schools did often look for some kind of forestry certification so that the biomass they were buying was associated with good forestry practices, but I'm not aware of any literature that states that that guarantees the carbon benefits, because the ecosystem dynamics, the soil dynamics, and the economic impacts on land use, both at the site and in the broader region, can all play a role in what the net effect of any given biomass harvest is. And in order to really understand what's going on here, we need more facility and region level analysis and study. So that's bioenergy in a nutshell. In the context of this commitment. And then obviously the largest category was offsets. So here's a figure that just shows a breakdown of the different kinds of offsets that schools were buying in 2021. You can see a really dominant role for landfill methane, but also some renewable energy projects, some forestry projects, and a mix of other things. And even if you only passingly follow things that are happening in the carbon offset space, you're probably aware that there's a large and growing body of literature that's been very critical of these voluntary offsets and whether they actually produce real greenhouse gas emissions reductions. There are efforts underway to improve the quality, but as far as we stand today, there's a lot of very serious questions about whether when you buy an offset, you're actually reducing emissions. And Barbara Haya et al. Had a paper in 2021 in Climate Policy where they looked at California's regulatory grade offset program, which is arguably the best in class out there at the moment. It was designed with insights from offset programs that had come before that had had issues. And they noted that even best practices result in significant uncertainty in what the true emissions reductions are. So just with this sort of strict mitigation lens, there's some reason to be concerned about this much reliance on offsets. And I think we should also apply a justice and equity lens. So schools that are using a lot of offsets instead of reducing their own emissions are continuing to emit both greenhouse gases on site, but also conventional air pollution, which can lead to lots of health impacts, which we know disproportionately fall on low-income individuals and people of color. And so because of both of these concerns, policymakers are increasingly choosing to limit offsets in the context of state-level policy. But this idea of strictly limiting when offsets can be used hasn't really trickled over into the accounting frameworks that higher education institutions are using. And then the other thing that we were really interested in thinking about as policy scholars when writing this paper is leverage, which is that this climate struggle is a national and global one. And we wanted, if schools are taking these actions, part of the motivation should be helping to drive this larger effort towards net zero emissions, say for the US. And we're in luck here because there have been some very analytical roadmaps of the kinds of strategies we're going to need to get to net zero as a country. So this is the long-term strategy of the United States, which was released by the Biden-Harris administration. And you can see they figure out sector by sector and strategy by strategy where we expect emissions reductions to come from. And you can see on the right that there might be some slight changes in the mix, but the overall pattern is pretty robust. And so what we did was we compared higher education climate actions and the relative mix to what was found in a similar strategy that was released by the Obama administration. And you can see that relative to the mid-century strategy, colleges and universities have been pursuing more bioenergy and more non-CO2 reductions. These are the landfill methane offsets, and relatively less electrification, energy efficiency, and new zero carbon electricity. Now, we wouldn't expect this to line up perfectly because colleges are not a perfect analog for greenhouse gas emissions in the US, but the misalignment was actually pretty striking to us. So if we think about these US decarbonization strategies, something on the order of 3/4 of the overall emissions come from basically three strategies: new zero carbon electricity, energy efficiency, and electrification of buildings and transportation. And when we look at the schools that had announced that they'd achieved neutrality, 3/4 of the reductions came from very different strategies, from offsets, from bioenergy, and from unbundled renewable energy credits. And I haven't talked about unbundled renewable energy credits much, but I'll just note here that these often come from renewable energy generation that is sort of already exists, and there's a large body of literature that suggests that it may actually not do much at all to reduce emissions. So this sort of disconnect between the two means that these HEI strategies, if they continue to play out in this fashion, aren't going to realize the full potential to drive these core strategies that are going to get the biggest emissions reductions in the US at scale. So again, I want to acknowledge that we've seen some really important institutional changes at many of these schools that have achieved carbon neutrality. They're having board level conversations about climate action, which you cannot say about all schools. They've hired sustainability directors. They're thinking hard about their energy infrastructure. But at the same time, we're also seeing very little reduction in the actual direct emissions at these schools. And the reductions that we are seeing under carbon neutrality are coming from a strategy that has some mix of much higher uncertainty, lower quality, and/or significant equity concerns. And furthermore, the current approaches that are dominating are not really scalable or aligned with national approaches, right? It's not a surprise that we can't get nationally to carbon neutrality if everybody buys offsets from somebody else. And this is, to me, a good example of Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it can cease to be a good measure. The current greenhouse gas accounting frameworks weigh all greenhouse gas emissions reductions equally. They treat them essentially as a commodity, where a ton of carbon here is a ton of carbon there, is a ton of carbon there, as long as it's in greenhouse gas equivalents. But what we know from the literature is that that's actually not true, that even if we just limit our focus to the greenhouse gas implications, there's a lot more uncertainty associated with the greenhouse gas implications of bioenergy and offsets than there is with a direct replacement with clean energy. And there's also differing equity implications and co-benefits of these different strategies. And so we should be wary of a framework that can push for folks towards the lowest cost reductions that may in fact have less system leverage or lower quality or fewer equity benefits. So based on this work, we wrote an op-ed, which we published in Inside Higher Ed, because college and university presidents are not reading the journal One Earth. And we talked about how we might think about, from a policy perspective, redesigning these commitments. And the first thing I've already hinted on is that we want to expand the number of schools with climate commitments and accelerate those commitments to before 2050. And we need to do that both because you can't really qualify as leadership if you're not moving ahead of the rest of the country. And secondly, because we really want people to confront infrastructure decisions now. I like to say that every commercial boiler that runs on fossil fuels that's installed today is probably a policy failure, because that boiler is still going to be around in 2050 when we need the whole country to be carbon neutral. And so by moving up these deadlines, we can get schools to focus on the infrastructure changes that they're making every year, the investments in buildings that they're making every year, the decisions they're making every year, and how that is going to be consistent or not consistent with a climate goal in the relatively near future. And the second thing we highlight, which I'll spend just a little bit more time on, is we think that an appropriate focus is asking schools to make explicit decarbonization commitments where they're committing to actually reduce the use of fossil fuels on campus by changing out their infrastructure, or directly deploying clean energy on campus where they can do that. And this gives me an opportunity to talk about some work I'm really proud of that's been going on at Smith College. So this is a drone photo of a open area on campus that is being filled in with geothermal wells to run a ground source heat pump system. And we're in the middle of this kind of decarbonization transition at Smith College. So we were relying on natural gas that was piped to campus. It's heated in boilers in a cogeneration plant, transmitted around campus in steam, and then it ends up at these sort of hissing, clanking radiators that many of you will know from your time in college. And the transition is going to be to purchasing renewable energy from new renewable energy developments, using that energy to power ground source heat pumps that transmit low temperature hot water and chilled water around campus and allow us to heat and cool our rooms. And here's a little map. Every building that's in light or dark blue is going to be changed as a result of the system, which is going in 3 phases. And what we see with this new system is going to be something on the order of an 80 to 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources. It's going to be a system with lower cost to operate, improved reliability, improved occupant comfort, increased cooling. All the buildings in light blue are going to pick up cooling as part of this retrofit. Greater cost stability because we can cut long-term contracts for the electricity, and then also lower conventional air pollution and water use. I wanted to flag 2 other things, which is obviously this transition does not come cheap. This is going to cost Smith about $210 million, which is going to be the largest capital investment in the college's history. So it speaks to the importance of mobilizing finance vehicles to help institutions make this happen. And the second thing is I'm pleased to report that this north of Elm district here, we already have some buildings chilling off the system this summer. But obviously we're not the first school to do this. And so we went back to the data to sort of understand what we might be missing by focusing on this big carbon neutrality lens instead of really drilling down and looking at decarbonization. So I already mentioned the median scope 1 reduction in the carbon neutral schools that we'd been studying in our paper was about 19%. And the largest non-bioenergy scope 1 reduction we saw was 30%. But if we look at other schools that are reporting their greenhouse gas emissions, we can see much larger reductions in scope 1. So I included this special case of Keene State, which reported a 92% reduction in the most recent data. They are using a bioenergy source of waste vegetable oil, but amongst all the options, this one is probably getting pretty close to carbon neutral. The key problem with waste vegetable oil is that even with a lot of fried food around, there's not enough waste vegetable oil to make this a very scalable solution for other institutions. And once we move past that position, we can see Ball State University, which has actually had a ground source heat pump system since 2012, and they've reduced their scope 1 emissions by 77%. St. Michael's College is another example in Vermont. They, in their most recent data on our provisional analysis, have a 72% reduction in emissions, and they're not even a second nature signatory to my knowledge. And then we can see a bunch of other schools, Miami University of Ohio, Carleton College, Westchester University, that have very significant reductions in their scope 1 emissions, all by deploying ground source heat pump technology. And we're seeing a lot of movement in this, what I would call the second wave of carbon neutral schools. So this is from some work that we did just looking at small liberal arts colleges, and you can see that there's a number of schools here that have operating networks, a bunch of other schools that have systems under construction. And in fact, I want to acknowledge that some of these may also be operating at this point. And then other schools that are either considering systems or have developed test wells or deploying ground source heat pumps in standalone building solutions. Right? And this is just the small colleges. Princeton is a good example of a university that has made that is much larger, that has also made investments in ground source heat pumps. And I am a big fan of ground source heat pumps, but obviously schools will be finding other solutions to decarbonize campus heating that are appropriate for their campuses and their physical plant. So we talked about the sort of first two planks in our op-ed, and I just wanted to wrap up by talking about three more things we note. The first is expanding the focus for Scope 3 emissions. I think early in the commitment, it made sense to sort of think about a limited universe of Scope 3 emissions from purchasing, but there's now much better data about the emissions associated with different kinds of goods and services. And there's also a lot more options just down the road from us in Holyoke, Massachusetts. There's a low carbon cement factory going up. Low carbon steel options are becoming available. There's a lot that can be done on food purchasing and land management. And we think schools should be encouraged to think about their ability to drive local and regional greenhouse gas emissions by addressing those emissions. And then for offsets, we think that the real role for higher education, because they're never going to be the big volume buyer that major corporate players are, is to drive innovation and experimentation. We know that we need to get finance to emissions reductions in other countries and to certain sectors that have a hard time doing this. And so schools getting creative about ways to provide finance to drive these pockets of emissions reductions, carbon storage, carbon removal in ways that are advancing equity and justice, I think would be a really important thing to focus on. And then finally, we think it's really important that institutions not view carbon neutrality as the sort of equivalent of individual action when it comes to climate change. These are system scale problems, and they need to be addressed at the system scale. And so we would love to see schools incentivized to broaden their focus to include things like policy advocacy, and also using their education and research to link up on regional scale solutions, whether those be mitigation solutions like supply chains for low carbon goods, or transportation systems, or resilience and adaptation strategies that where higher ed can play a really useful convening role and bring a lot of expertise to the table. And I wanted to end on an optimistic note, which is that Second Nature is in the process of reevaluating its climate commitments, and we're very interested to see what that product looks like, and with the hope that it's going to incentivize stronger behavior and encourage more people to sign on to the commitment. And there's also some other frameworks that are floating out there that, for example, are encouraging better accounting of Scope 3, target dates by 2050, better treatment of biogenic emissions and those kinds of things. So I think things have the potential to move in the right direction, but it's going to require pressure for institutions to sign up and deliver on these higher quality commitments. So I want to wrap up just by saying that every ton of avoided emissions matters at this point. And our work suggests that this corporate climate reporting framework that was sort of developed in the 1990s isn't really delivering on the change that we need. And we need resets with increased ambition and a focus on system change that's bringing in this justice lens as well. But the good news is we have lots of solutions that we can deploy, that lots of colleges and universities are deploying, and the details at each institution are going to matter in terms of what they can do now versus in the near future, and where the sort of highest leverage opportunities for impact are located. And with that point, I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Barron. Wow, that's really important research and some really disappointing information coming out of it, but that it's so important for everybody to know, and I don't think a lot of people do. So for the audience, we have some time for questions. Again, you can put your questions in the chat space on YouTube, and we'll get through as many as we can. And we do have a question to start things off. Your report is sobering. Having schools meet their carbon neutrality through accounting-based measures such as offsets and RECs can be argued as greenwashing. And as you noted, claiming bioenergy as carbon neutral seems specious. Many higher education institutions are facing budget challenges. So what is the best way to argue the financial benefits for actually taking Scope 1 emissions reductions? Moving to renewable energy, including thermal energy networks and weatherization improvements in campus buildings can provide financial benefits over time.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I do want to acknowledge that that this is a rough time for many higher education institutions financially. Things were rough before the pandemic, and the pandemic has largely not helped matters. And then the rise in interest rates has made a lot of this stuff even harder. And so I think actually, part of the solution here is that higher education leaders need to be advocating for policymakers to make it easier for institutions to do this work. I think, we want to get to a place where it is a no-brainer for an institution to make these infrastructure changes over time. I think that we can see that, in some places, rooftop solar has started to look like that kind of investment for individual consumers, or buying an EV as their next car. But between the interest rates and access to capital, I think that institutions are going to need help. And so that's probably the first thing that institutions should do is, if they have a clear climate plan that they want to deliver on, or if people would like their institution to have a clear climate plan that they can deliver on, advocating for resources to make this happen can be really important. I'm a little optimistic here because the Inflation Reduction Act and its direct pay provisions have really opened up a big universe of additional support for on-site renewables, for energy storage, including some components of ground source heat pump systems. And as Smith goes through the initial process of getting some of those direct pay rebates, we're going to be excited to share that. And I think that there'll be a bunch of early movers who are able to share insights in that space. And also the launch of these green banks, both at the state level and supported by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund at the federal level. I think if those institutions are designing their programs smartly, there should be ways for higher education institutions to get access to lower cost capital. So I think the first aspect of this is to go looking for ways to make the finances just work better for institutions. But I also think that there's a lot of thinking that institutions can do to ensure that they're thinking about things in the right way. I think we still have a tendency to sort of think about the return on an energy efficiency investment in, like, does it pay back in 3 years, or some similarly very short time scale, and moving towards a thing where people are doing life cycle cost analysis and looking like, does this make sense over the next 30 years? And asking questions like, is this consistent with our long-term climate target? Can also sort of help drive this action. But, I can tell you that at Smith, and I think this is the lesson of the other schools that have looked at this, when we look at these investments, for example, in ground source heat pumps as a long-term investment, we are adopting them in part because they're going to offer both a long-term savings to the institution and a lot of cost stability, right? So we can contract for this renewable energy, and we're not going to be at the whim of having some kind of geopolitical conflict drive up the cost of natural gas and make for a very hard budget year for us, or a very cold winter or something like that. And so you get both predictability and sort of lower operating costs over the long run. And those are the kinds of things that can really help stabilize an institution's finances in the long run. So you have to sort of build a culture around this and sort of look to other institutions for good practices on making a lot of these energy efficiency investments and sort of building them into the budget, and then tapping into state and federal incentives to make things as cost effective as possible.
Excellent. Thank you. It's a helpful response. Another question. You mentioned an expanded focus on food. Numerous schools, hospitals, and other institutions have moved toward default plant-based models, given the immense climate impacts of animal agriculture, particularly meat and dairy. Can you please say a bit more about this kind of approach?
Yeah, I think, as I said, in the current commitment, it food purchasing is not considered as part of a school's greenhouse gas emissions. And so, and I'm actually, this is going to be a somewhat controversial view, but I'm not a big fan of schools investing a ton of energy in trying to get a detailed inventory of exactly how many emissions are associated with their food purchasing, because that can take a lot of data that a school might or might not have, and a lot of resources, energy, and as the questioner noted, we're aware of the largest footprint foods, things like beef and dairy, when it comes to the climate footprint. And so schools can adopt policies that are going to reduce those emissions. And actually, if they happen to have a list of schools that have aggressive policies there, I would love them to email that to me at Smith College, because I would love to include more of that in talks. But we have seen institutions that are adopting measures to offer more plant-based alternatives, to offer burgers that are reducing the amount of beef and mixing it with something else. And I think different institutions are going to find the right mix there. But as diet is an important part of our climate solution toolkit, and students at higher education institutions can sometimes be building lifelong food habits, I think there's an area for leverage there. At Smith, we also spend a bunch of time thinking about our role in the local food supply chain. And so places that are, in a position to do that can also really be building sustainable food economies locally, which is another reason to sort of not have food outside of our climate space and stuff that we care about.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting that College of the Atlantic initially in 2007 claimed to have achieved neutrality and now no longer achieves it. Do you know why that is? Is it a recognition of truth in accounting with life cycle emissions, or what led to that?
Yeah, I think that's our sense. So what we write up in the paper is that our understanding of what happened there is that they were eager to achieve carbon neutrality, and then as they thought about it more, they really wanted to focus their efforts on actually reducing emissions on campus, and so that's what they've been doing in this subsequent time period. So they're sort of an early leader on both fronts, on sort of trying to move forward with a commitment to carbon neutrality, but also an early leader in terms of rethinking what it means to display leadership in this space and what meaningful climate action looks like. And I think it'll be interesting when we come back in a few years, and by a few years, I mean not many, to look at many of these schools, some of whom's commitments are now 10 years in the rearview. Achievement of neutrality is now, close to 10 years in the rearview mirror, to see, have they made further progress to reduce their emissions in these various categories. I know some schools have been working very aggressively on that. Others, it's been less clear. And so I think that'll be part of understanding the robustness of the commitment, because you could imagine a model where a school rushes to get to carbon neutrality. It's called the neutrality first approach, and then continues to work on these other sectors. But if that's not occurring everywhere, that can be really problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, they deserve credit for not trying to take the easy way out if
Yeah.
that's the case.
Yeah. And I just want to sort of double down on this point on decarbonization, which is that we think that there's a lot to be said for recognizing schools that have decarbonized significantly on campus, even if they have decided, some of them might not even be able to buy renewable energy certificates where they are, or purchase green power through their utility because of policy barriers. And they might have decided, we don't trust offsets to buy them enough for our scope 3 emissions, or we don't have the budget to do that. But that can still be a leadership role, even if they haven't gotten around to those other steps.
Yeah. So someone asked, you mentioned mitigation. Is there any emphasis on simply reducing the amount of energy expended rather than looking into more sustainable sources of energy?
Yeah. So as you saw from the long-term strategy that I showed, and our analysis comparing to the US mid-century strategy, energy efficiency is a really critical component of any effort to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it's important to not bring the sort of efficiency mindset of the 1970s to the decarbonization problem, because making a fossil system more efficient is, a system that's ultimately sort of heated by fossil fuels, for example, more efficient, is going to reduce emissions, but is not by itself going to get you to zero emissions. And so, you could imagine at the extreme that if you had a system that was running on very cheap solar power that was completely fueled by electricity, you would care a lot less on how efficient the buildings were, right? Because the extra electricity is also carbon free. Now, in reality, that does not yet exist. And in reality, to get, for example, a ground source heat pump system or an air source heat pump system sized appropriately and affordably, you're going to need to combine building retrofits with this sort of ongoing work to change out the energy infrastructure. And when you do that, you get two things. One is that these heat pump systems, whether air or ground source, are a lot more efficient than these fossil systems. So you're gaining efficiency by doing that. And then you're getting a pathway to actually zeroing out the emissions. But schools should absolutely be combining that with whatever they decide is the sort of cost-effective increment of upgrading insulation, air sealing, replacing mechanical equipment, and all those kinds of things, because that stuff is often very cost effective over very short time scales, and will help make the economics of the larger transition happen.
Okay, so balanced.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll squeeze in one more.
Okay.
In one of your first slides, you talked about you showed the curve of emissions reductions and the role that the Inflation Reduction Act would play in the prediction of how much emissions reductions we can expect. So with a policy like that is mostly incentives, do you have concerns about the ability of policies that are centered on incentives or voluntary behavior achieving the predicted emissions reductions?
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time working on regulatory policies and congressional legislation that would provide at least more certainty on us achieving our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. I think that I would rather have an incentive-based structure, an aggressive incentive-based policy than no policy at all, which is largely where we were before the Inflation Reduction Act. But that modeling is contingent on a lot of things. For example, building enough transmission. Probably the biggest one is building enough transmission and siting enough renewables to achieve the economically efficient amount of deployment that those models are showing. And so we could end up falling short of that measure. On the other hand, if we have another 4 years of federal policymaking that is really going to direct things towards trying to deploy clean energy, and states and regions get serious about taking advantage of these incentives, I think it's also possible that we could overperform relative to projections of these voluntary initiatives. And then hopefully that sort of cleaner economy with lots more stakeholders who are benefiting from the economic advantages of this build out will make it easier to have a combination of mixing incentives with other measures that are really going to do a better job of guaranteeing that we get the emissions reductions we need to do over the long.
That seems like the perfect place to end, that hopeful note.
Yes.
So we're out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Barron. That was a really interesting presentation. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. Our next talk will happen on Tuesday of next week at 12 o'clock. Hope you all have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks for joining.